Thank you very much to Digital Earth for inviting me. As I promised in Paris last week, I was going to put bones to the flesh to the bones that I laid out in my Paris talk, in which I called for something that I called for back in 2017 at TED Global, which is a new mode of critical thinker-doer that doesn't just criticize or critique and do nothing, or do without critical thought, but actually engages in what I call knowledge in service of problem solving. I come today not as an MIT associate professor. I am not coming here as an academic. I am coming here to just tell you what I said I would do back in 2017, which is that from now on, I would not write anything that I had not proven to work, nor would I engage in any knowledge production that was not geared towards solving any problem. That's the background to what I'm going to say today. At the time in 2017, I was seriously thinking about what I had done for my own community in Zimbabwe, seeing as I had contributed some to the global knowledge machine. And I went back to fulfill one of my ambitions, which was to basically transform my homestead into a kind of open laboratory, not in the Western sense. I simply mean a place where people can try out new ideas and based on a synthesis of all knowledges available to them, be they those that they generate themselves or those that they can find anywhere at all, including and not limited to their itineration in the world. What you see here is the beginning of Research Design Build, which is an initiative that I have started in fulfillment of that self-challenge in 2017, where I wanted to act as a catalyst in my own community to drive local initiatives that take people's knowledge seriously, what I called in my first book, Technologies of Everyday Innovation, by which I simply meant that people in Africa, possibly elsewhere, who may or may not have gone to school, are not simply tabula rasa, where we map our own knowledge subjectivities, nor is Africa simply fodder for Western theory. Africa could be regarded as a thinking continent. People who face not just adversity, but opportunity, and meet it with equal measure of creative resilience. In short, intellectual agents who produce and apply knowledge. And what I was trying to do was to invest and build upon that knowledge and bring that knowledge which I had learned through traveling and meeting, which I thought, as one who belongs to this society, could be useful without necessarily imposing it. So we started construction on this in 2019 in January this year. This is us trying to create a foundation. This is where the building was by April. this is where it is now. Usually when I'm home, that's where I conduct my affairs from now on. So the first role was to create a catalytic space from which I can think with my own folks. The second was to create a network of critical thinkers who are also doers. One of the problems that I identified is that it is very conceited to think you know it all, but to exercise a sense of humility when you come before knowledge. And the problems that people confront in the everyday and the opportunities they have and the stratagems they apply will require multiple skill sets in order to understand them. And so what I've been trying to do is to work with various sectors of society, including my local councillor, right on the left here, various institutions, the council, the technical government departments responsible for rural development, to reach across the aisle, because there's often this disjuncture and a lack of communication or collaboration between the humanities, arts and social sciences on the one hand, and the bench sciences and engineering on the other. My experience tells me that when we talk of interdisciplinarity, usually all we are talking about is an anthropologist collaborating with a historian, collaborating with an economics, or in engineering, it is different branches of engineering that are engaged in conversation. What I've also seen is even among institutions that claim to be innovative is merely a rehashing of idioms by departments that are still very pedantic in the way they approach knowledge. One of the surprises was that there is nothing really creative that much about engineering at all. And that, in fact, engineering is, to all intents and purposes, about applying or studying or doing things that are methodical. So what I was trying to do here was to break a different ground. Could, for example, a counselor work with a molecular biologist, that gentleman who is in glasses? Could somebody who works for a non-governmental organization that does integrated skills training work with, say, an agricultural university? And could those reach across to work with business, for example? And could artists and philosophers work together? Could historians work with engineers? If the goal is to come up with a mix that can offer something that I'll say shortly, which is that to build sustainable systems, you have to do knowledge sustainably. So this was a photo we took of our meeting, turning these configurations into an actual body that would collaborate to populate the kind of activities we envisaged in that building. This was right after the TED experience, where I arrived in the village to find that the community had already decided that they want to put electricity in the village. My thought was, why are they focusing on grid instead of solar? the thing with modernity is that there is no one modernity. Pata Chatterjee talks of what he calls modernity in two languages. But he also suggests that they don't even need to be two. There can be many modernities. Your modernity, my modernity, everybody else's modernity. If what we are describing here is aspirations towards a future self-determined to be better or different, or that maintains the same level but in ways more comfortable. And to these villagers who are my kin, they were mobilizing two very interesting things. One is the concept of Nimbe. In South Africa and other places called Intima. And I'm sure those that come from or have worked in other places like West Africa and East Africa can testify. Intima is when you have a vulnerable member of society, or when you have a bumper harvest, or you have many fields to plow. What you do is you either collectively gather food for that person who's vulnerable, or that person gathers the food themselves and beer. You don't have to worry about music because there are a lot of musicians, drummers, chord shakers and so forth. In any case, music comes very easily when you are drunk. So you gather these as methods of mobilizing labor on a village-wide scale or community-wide scale. Work that was supposed to be done inside over a month can usually take a day, whether it's building a house, clearing a field, or weeding it, or harvesting, etc., etc. And that concept was being extended here to cut out labor costs, because it would have cost much more to get somebody who was going to dig all these holes to put these pylons in. The other thing that was happening here was, I then came up with the suggestion that, do we have our own members of community who have done this work, who are electricians who can install this? They call them linesmen. And we said, let's go from family to family to look at a family tree and see what we have. We ended up having 10 of these, and we selected the most skilled one. And out of that experience, we were able to electrify our village. The one thing that I quickly realized upon further research was, which is the ability to bring your research capabilities or your skills, which not many people in the village have, to bring them in order to make otherwise difficult work easier, was to think in terms of this being an adaptable or adaptive infrastructure, where it could have possibilities in future for, say, generating and selling power back to the grid. So at the moment, this is where we are at. The problem we're solving with electricity was the question of very sparse wood and trees. This is my area. We don't have too many trees. And the idea behind it was that people were thinking that it's a good thing to have electricity, but it's a more assured source of energy anyway. I was thinking of it in terms of the next point, which is the effects of climate change. Let me say that people often mistake this debate. I'm not coming to it from the high-handed scientific community, which is talking about Greenland and the melting ice caps and so on and so forth. That is not where I usually come from. I usually want to come from everyday life. It's my choice. Everybody else is free to come from Greenland. and carbon credits and stuff. That's too heavy for me. I'm coming from a place where people have seen for a very long time the pastures that are no longer generating. This is summer, midsummer, but the grasses barely grow that tall. If left on their own, these grasses usually grow as high as that, but it's dry and it's you know, it's sparse. So the question was, what do we do about this? The second problem was one of crops that are wilting. And this wilting doesn't take place throughout the summer. It's only a few weeks that can devastate the entire crop. If you check in many geographical regions of Africa, only a few weeks can devastate an entire crop. By the time the rains come, and they come big, the crop is already spoiled. You only have a third of the potential yield. So one of the first initiatives that led to that picture you saw there was farmers meeting and us saying, what do we do about this problem? The first example, the first thing that came to them is that we need to plant more grass, more drought-resistant grass, and possibly consider possibilities of paddocks, because this is a communal area stretching for about 10 miles by about 2-3 miles wide along the river. And the way they were thinking about this is, let's plant grass. So I said, where do we get the grass? And one farmer who is distinguished himself said, no, there is an institute called Grasslands Research Station. It specializes in grasses. The rest is history. We approached grasslands. This is one extent where you can use your influence. It's not very often that you knock into an office and say you're a professor, let alone an MIT professor, and get ignored. So I said, aha, this is one opportunity where I could utilize this, and let's see. And lo and behold, the doors opened. Now, if you are a councillor who is considered a very lowly figure in a community or in politics, because you just represent a ward, you're not even the member of parliament, you're not even a senior party official, you are ground zero when it comes to interfacing government, in particular, ground zero of government, the starting point. The chances of you even meeting the secretary and getting an appointment to talk to a member of parliament, a minister, or a vice chancellor of a university is next to zero. So the power to unlock is the second catalytic effect. The picture you see at the bottom there is us planting the grass. We planted about 10 varieties of grass, plus 3 varieties of short shrubs that actually spread very quickly, are indigenous to the area, and have capability to feed goats in particular and other animals. Okay, the third problem, which is the last one, was when you see this river now, it's all green and lush. If there is heavy rain, the water reaches up to here, and the floodplain goes all the way to there. It's one vast sea, more like this one. One vast sea of water just careening away. But you won't believe that in winter, most of that water goes away. In my first discussions with the Department of Irrigation, they suggested building a dam. We all know, again, one area where I thought I would render service to my community, knowing what I know about global trends in big dams. We knew that if this thing went wrong, all communities, including mine, so I was not disinterested, would be washed away. So obviously we could not have that. So I went and talked to the director of irrigation and said, I think it's a bad idea. the possibilities that we could build weirs on these dams, very short affairs that take only the water that you say you need and let the rest go to the next one and the next one and the next one and the next one until you create a wetland. And one example that did this with its rivers is China. So how do you do that? The question that I was trying to pose was, as an intellectual, not academic, an intellectual, intellection in service of problem solving. Could we, for example, because it's a very rocky area, could we make water from stones? Now, how do you do that? How do you make water out of granite? Now, for what we were trying to do here was also based on prior research. I had noticed that there were these strange features along the river which suggested that there had been prior human modification along the lines of weirs that were constructed probably poorly and without cement and got washed away, without reinforcement and got washed away. So we went and surveyed this, about 10 of these. I was at MIT at the time, and I remember drawing rough drawings and sending maps to the councillor and said, "Councillor, can you go and survey this area and see which one is the best? I recommend this place, this place, this place." I was also using my experiential knowledge of this area because that's where I basically grew up. One in particular was this one. And so we decided to construct a weir there by clearing first. And then, because it's dry, this is the same river in winter. This is the riverbed, completely dry. So we say this is the best time to harvest river sand, and which is mixed with concrete stones, which you need anyway to mix with cement in order to create a strong bond, since dry bonding can still leave cracks if you are constructing a weir. This is us. I think I'm the one with the shovel there in the overalls. This is our councillor, and this is one of the neighbors engaged in a kind of nimbe. I bought all the food basically. Nobody drank, they are all church going, so that was easy on my pocket, and we are all set. I have to say it's very heavy work. This is us removing stones, and the way we did it was to use this digging road. And this is in Zimbabwe they are called the sabuk, the head of the village, leading from the front. The thing with this is that because nothing is tried out yet, people don't believe that you can just come out of your professoriate, your high chair, and do these kinds of things, because our education system was conditioned in such a way that when you are educated, you are lost to your community. You can't identify as a tribesman or a native. But you can't assimilate fully either. In the French system, they call it the évolué. In the Portuguese system, they call it the assimilados. And I was trying to move out of that label. It remains true that most of our academics are évolué or assimilados. Once they are gone, that's it. And so we work together, and you also have to lead from the front. You can't just sit there or write a good thesis and say, hey, this could make such a good idea. In the real world, it doesn't work that way. This is why a lot of our very good ideas fail. Because we write excellent theses, or we publish something and expect something to be taken up. By whom? Hey, if it was good enough, one would think at the very least you'd implement it yourself or mobilize for its implementation with you leading. Anyway, this is how we built our ware. These rocks are natural. That is where the original ware had been built. My thinking is that it could have been colonial programs, but I still cannot rule out the possibility that in my own ancestors' history, they had knowledge of bridging water. After all, you are talking of people who, if history and the archaeolinguistics is right, these are people that migrate, whose great ancestors migrated from the Nile Valley via the circuitous routes of West and East Africa until they got to Southern Africa, so-called Bantu. So, and you could see these marks here. That was me, as late as last week, asking these folks on the ground to modify and widen this particular area because it was too narrow. That could constitute a breachable point if it rained heavily and there were floods. That is what they finally did and came up with a structure that had. So, as I said, the reason why so since then we have been engaged in other projects. We are looking now at how to utilize the many flies that are in our area, these big green flies, with possibilities for making maggots and which make very good chicken feed, organic chicken feed. We have since moved to looking at ways of making sure that local farmers, because this is an intensive vegetable production area, leaf vegetable production area, how we can prevent these middlemen from the city that are ripping them off by thinking of a more democratic, organic form of export, if that's what they want, or a local exchange. We are now at a stage where we are going to be partnering with one United Nations arm in order to begin training young people in systematic problem solving, in addition to the systematic problem solving they already have, with emphasis on two skills that I think I should have had growing up. Entrepreneurship is one, knowledge of the digital would be another. Because we can't keep them in the past. We have to appreciate that they have their own versions of modernity, which want to keep up with the world. But to do so in a way that really retains that which is designed by them, known to them, dear to them, while always having a sophisticated system of tapping into that which is good in the world they live in, beyond their horizon. So this is what we are doing. I am not here as a historian, an anthropologist, a philosopher, just somebody who is trying to mobilize knowledge in service of problem solving. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. As was already explained, the title of my talk is What is Innovation Anyway? I think it's important in the context of these kind of get-togethers where so many words are going to be uttered to think a little bit about the words that we're using and kind of probe them a bit. So innovation in critical times is a really interesting topic for sure, an inspiring topic. But I think beneath that lurks the question of what innovation even means and how you're kind of interpreting innovation and who's innovating as it relates to critical times, which I suppose is what the main subject is in most of the conversations, the nature of our times. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but before I do that, I wanted to also respond a bit to the topic of digital earth as a phrase, which I think is a really interesting, provocative, and important phrase. Yeah, I think this picture here is something I wanted to contribute to the conversation. I certainly respect and appreciate the previous discussion about different, which was so focused on difference and so focused on recognizing ownership and recognizing appropriation, recognizing heroes and villains. But I will say that sometimes I do think a sort of scale up is also worth considering. If you think about that's where we are right now, and you think from a sort of galactic level, and you think about the unbelievably long odds that we've managed to overcome just to simply exist as a planet, and certainly to exist as a species, I think some of the conversation that we all have and that define in our absolutely essential, valuable conversations to understand how to better coexist as a species, also kind of have an element of the narcissism of minor differences to them. Because in the end, we're all occupying a speck that's floating in space. And maybe you could say, well, there's nothing else floating in space, so actually our culture is what matters the most. But I think you could also say the opposite. Okay, so I just wanted to, again, say a little something about the notion of digital earth. I think it's an incredibly provocative phrase, an incredibly important one. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways that we've come to understand the earth as a result of technology and a result of the digitization of life. This is one. This is basically a map of all of the Facebook friendships that emerged from the years 2010 to 2014. And you can see that by 2014, you basically have an alternate projection of the Earth, which is entirely based on Facebook friendships, which are, of course, a very specific kind of friendship that I won't talk about. But I would say this is an important dimension of the digital Earth, a new way to imagine the Earth, which is entirely based on connections which transcend space. Another way to think about the digital Earth that we should consider, and of course I know that we all do consider and live with, is Google Maps, and the way that basically the layers of data that are applied to the Earth allow us to explore it in new ways, and obviously allow us to kind of define it in new ways. And I think this is important to say because if you know what Google Earth is up to, it's actually a kind of heroic project, which is managing to basically document every inch of the planet, and is ultimately achieving the great sort of Borges provocation of a map that's the size of a territory. That's actually what Google is achieving, with obviously many partners. And I think in that case, that really encourages us to really think about what that means. When you've datafied the world and when you've actually come up with a sort of infrastructure that allows you to look at it as pure information, what does that actually mean, and what are the implications of it in regard to innovation and critical times? Of course, one of the things it allows us to do is simply monetize it and explore it as a commercial landscape in the most efficient way possible. Another thing that allows us to do is basically create a shadow world which is entirely for machines. This is an example of a Waymo self-driving car, the way that it sees. And basically this is the digital Earth, because this is really the Earth for purely digital beings. And it's something which exists in parallel to our own Earth, and of course it intersects with ours, but more and more, certainly among the people in the tech sector and the many people who fund them, I think the assumption is that ultimately this version of the Earth is going to have a greater influence than the sort of traditional physical understanding of the Earth. And I think this is really important because I just want to tell a little story about the Earth and the digitization and datification of the Earth. Because I think it says a lot about where innovation is going and where we as a people, where we as a human race, regardless of our differences, are kind of heading. For many, many years, for the vast majority of human existence and also pre-human existence, the sea, sorry, just as a preface, I want to talk a little bit about maps and the sea, and how and their role in the digital Earth. So for many, many years, the sea was this majestic landscape of mystery and danger and romance. It was a place of monsters, and it was a place also, of course, of it had some economic dimensions, but ultimately it was something which was kind of vast and unknowable, and almost a kind of poetic representation of the unknowable. But eventually, we figured out a way to kind of understand it and rationalize it and kind of operationalize it. And that's a process which has a kind of long history, but basically it brought us to the current moment where what the sea is no longer a space of majesty and romance and mystery. It's simply a resource that you use, and particularly in the kind of international shipping regime that we live in, it's basically a kind of machine for moving goods around. And this process of digitization and datification is what allowed us to do this, to take something which was deep and mysterious and complex and turn it into something which is flat and highly functional and simple. And so, the story of that, it's not actually that complicated of a story. The sort of first effort to try to do that started with the ancient Greeks, who came up with a sort of grid system to understand. That understanding kind of went dormant for a long time and then was resurrected during the Renaissance, during the kind of height of trade and wanting to be able to move around the planet as much as possible. The sort of one of the key breakthroughs is the great Flemish cartographer Mercator was able to come up with what ultimately is the sort of prototype for the way that we understand the Earth now, with the grid system of latitude and longitude. And basically what that allowed us to do is start on the path towards knowing every single element of the Earth, where it's located, how you can navigate it, and where you are at any given time. So ultimately what that ended up with is turning the Earth into a kind of spreadsheet. And that's basically what the Earth exists now under a regime of GPS and Google Earth and everything else. Basically what GPS does is organizes satellites to be able to know within a meter, and I'm sure that space is like shrinking by the day, but to know within a meter of accuracy where anything is on the planet at any given time. So that's a sort of hyper-efficient, hyper-rational instrument for understanding the vast complexity, vast mystery, depth, romance, and also kind of unknowability of the planet, and particularly of the sea. So this matters a lot because I think this is basically the precedent for what is going to increasingly happen to us as individuals. A really important other digital Earth that we should know is coming is virtual reality. I know that a lot of you probably don't care about virtual reality, but I can tell you that there's a tremendous amount of effort going into virtual reality, and there's a tremendous amount of people who are highly incentivized to encourage us to spend as much time as possible within a virtual space and make that as enticing and as convenient a space as possible to the detriment of physical life. And certainly Mark Zuckerberg is one of them. And his dream of 1 billion people in virtual reality is something that is being very passionately and stupidly pursued. So the danger of that is this, basically. The danger is that we kind of occupy a virtual space, which is a kind of simulation of the physical space, in some ways superior to the physical because it's more flexible, it's more personalizable, etc. But of course, also potentially puts us in a situation of basically detaching ourselves from the physical in favor of a digital Earth. And I think there's a million problems related to that. One of the big ones is that ultimately spending more and more time in a virtual space makes you less and less, lowers your stamina for the difficulties of dealing with non-virtual space, the inconvenience of it, and the sort of, let's just call it the inconvenience of dealing with other people and dealing with improvisation. This is exactly what virtual reality is designed to remove from your existence. And of course, there's a certain amount of feedback you're going to get from the non-virtual people who don't really appreciate you stumbling around in their world. And I think it's really important to talk about this in the context of innovation, because I can say, as somebody who's worked a lot with technologists and collaborated with a lot of the sort of defining companies and figures in innovation and technology, I can tell you that there is really a really, really profound and deeply ingrained anti-human bias in technology. And I think that this ad is one of those like totally unintentionally amazing manifestos where basically you have a couple and the girl loves the boy, and then the boy is playing video games and ignoring the girl, and then the selling point is escape. So basically, whoever made this is some kind of obviously sociopath, but also a kind of genius in the efficiency of this, because this is actually what most tech is selling you. It's selling you, you never have to be constrained by physical life and by the kind of unpredictability and annoyingness of people, because you've always got this out. And the out is a video game, and the out is social media, the out is virtual reality, augmented reality. This is the sort of fundamental baseline of this kind of innovation. And I think all of our discussion about human culture needs to be affected by this understanding, because ultimately, as I see it, not to be like melodramatic and also not to simplify things, because I'm not trying to demonize the makers of technology, but I would say there is a kind of human versus tech battle going on, and I would say that one side is winning and the other side doesn't even know the battle's happening. So I do think we need to be aware of that in the context of digital Earth as a topic. Because this is where we live. We live in the age of the divine computer and kind of unimaginable expectations for what machine learning can do. And so the reason why I wanted to show that thing about the digital Earth and about Mercator and the rationalization of the Earth is that basically I would say that the same process that took place then, the process of taking something complex like the sea and turning it into something rationalized and simple and empirical, like a spreadsheet, is basically what's going to happen to the human self, and at the risk of being kind of melodramatic, the human soul. Because there's a tremendous amount of investment going on in emotional technology. This is just one example, Effectiva, which is from MIT. Shout out to MIT, for the second time. And basically what it is, it's an emotional recognition engine. It's a facial recognition engine that analyzes your facial expression and assigns a kind of emotion to it for advertisers, for various people who would kind of like to know what you're feeling. It's obviously in a very rudimentary form, but I would say the thing that this picture suggests to me is the unbelievable limitations of what this thing can recognize, because I don't, as a human being with a complex human history and a complex understanding of the human face, do not conclude that this face is expressing 100% joy. I think there's a much richer story going on there that this poor algorithm is not quite able to capture. And I think that this is the really, really scary thing about this. And just to call on another kind of Greek reference, Procrustes, if you know the story, it's basically a kind of famous kind of, another kind of sociopath. A famous person who basically would torture people by putting them into a bed that was the wrong size for them, and either he would stretch their bodies to fit the bed or cut off their feet in order to fit the bed. And that's basically what algorithms do, and particularly as it comes to emotion and the human experience, that's what's happening basically. In order to fit into this Procrustean bed, your complexity and your feet, among other things, have to be cut off because it's simply too complicated to actually be able to channel it through anything like an algorithm. Ultimately, computers are not smart. And what they can understand is very, very limited. So you have to manipulate what you're giving them so that they can understand it and make it functional. And that's an element of what's happening with the digital Earth, and it's certainly an element of what's going to happen to the digital human. And this is happening not only in the digital space, but also in the space of biotechnology. So it's a very similar thing that this is a slide that the CEO of Samsung presented recently about biobanks, biodatabanks, and what can be done when tech companies and governments have control of all of the biological data, all of our health data, and sort of understand us on an epigenetic level, what they're able to do with it as a new kind of resource and as a new raw material. And all of that within a design context or even an artistic context should be understood within a larger story, which is about computer-aided design. So computer-aided design, for everyone who's a designer or an architect knows, it's basically just tools that emerged in the last couple decades that allowed what used to be analog processes to be done on a computer, basically. So it started off very simply. You could make a blueprint on a computer rather than on a desk. And then it kind of evolved into you can design entire forms of architecture that would be totally impossible without a computer. And Dubai is a kind of showcase of a lot of that. So the interesting thing to say is that the company that has created this, Autodesk, who basically produced the defining computer-aided design technologies for architecture and industrial design, they've released a new thing called Genetic Constructor, which is basically computer-aided design for genes. So basically the tools that they applied to buildings, they're now applying to the raw material of human existence, and non-human, of course. It'll start without humans. We don't want to be narcissistic. It'll start with simple life forms and then ratchet up. So the question really in terms of innovation and innovating in critical times and understanding what the hell innovation is actually what does that mean? So if basically computer-aided design got us to Guggenheim Bilbao, because Guggenheim Bilbao was basically the first building that was designed in a computer and basically wasn't possible to build without computer modeling, what is Genetic Constructor going to produce? And this is an absolutely open question in our critical times and part of our issue of innovation. So then the question is, if you have a technology like this, what is going to shape it? What is going to make it good or bad or productive, unproductive? What is actually going to happen to this technology, which ultimately, and this is why I don't want to vilify tech people. When you know them, they're just hardworking people trying to make a great product. Like they're just trying to do something meaningful like everybody else in the world. So it's not really them to blame. It's more the kind of system through which their work is processed. And it's this kind of issue that this is a poster made by Facebook's Analog Research Lab with this quote from McLuhan, which actually isn't from McLuhan. But anyways, we shape our tools and in turn our tools shape us. So this idea of, our technology, we can't be indifferent to it because ultimately our technology will have a radical effect on us whether we like it or not, and it does anyway. But then the other kind of slogan for Facebook is move fast and break things, and that's kind of the problem, is that these technologies are basically developed in a kind of ethical and philosophical vacuum. And so that means that, that's a foreshadowing of a future point. So that basically means that, whereas maybe the academic world, which is there was some kind of shots at the academic impotence in the previous presentation, you can attack that for saying that it's just thinking and never acting. The problem with the technology in Silicon Valley and a lot of, not just Silicon Valley, but the Silicon Valley that you find in many other countries on Earth, is that it's all about action and very little forethought. And it's all kind of retroactively trying to understand what the effects of what you've done are. And of course, what that means in contemporary life is that the market basically is left to decide how a technology like Genetic Constructor should be used. What effect it should have on all of us, what its priorities should be, what its value should be. And this is a really massive problem because, as was mentioned in the previous conversation, the problem with the challenge of our critical time that we're currently living in is that free market capitalism is the atmosphere that we exist in. So it's very hard to get outside of the atmosphere. So when you're trying to talk about it, it's a bit like this kitten who's basically pushing up against an invisible barrier, which is simply the assumptions of what actually technology is for, what society is for, what government is for, what actually we're supposed to be delivering, and what innovation ultimately is for. So in order to talk about innovation and talk about innovation in critical times, it's really essential that we get out of that invisible barrier and that we free this kitten. And sometimes there are things that happen that allow you to see the barrier. And every once in a while, the free market will reveal itself with such purity that you can go, oh, right, that's why it's going to happen. So this is an example where Goldman Sachs, in a report that they made about the potential of biotechnology, asked, is curing patients a sustainable business model? So that's what you know. That's what's going to happen to it. Because ultimately, a sustainable business model matters much more than health, matters much more than noble ambitions, or the immense potential of an emerging technology. What actually matters is a sustainable business model according to Goldman Sachs. So that lets us know, okay, that's what innovation is. What innovation is something which is basically existing to serve an interpretation of reality, interpretation of the world that is basically about sustainable business models and delivering returns to capitalists, venture capitalists. And I think this is really important because innovation as a term is really killing it right now. This is Ngram, which is Google's tool for tracking the appearance of terms over history. So this is basically the incredible increase in appearances of the word innovation over time. We're living in a moment of peak innovation and delirious, ecstatic innovation. That certainly is true here. I'm involved in Dubai as part of the Dubai Future Foundation with very, very heavy investment effort in innovation. And so that makes it that much more important, and we certainly talk about it all the time. What the hell is innovation and why? Why are you doing it? What ends are it serving? And basically, who gets to decide what's a valuable innovation and what isn't? So, for example, if you take something like this, this is without a doubt representative of a tremendous amount of incredible innovations. The technological, economic, physical genius that is required to produce this shouldn't be undervalued. However, the problem is, do you need that? Do you need a golf course in the middle of a place where you should have never, ever, under any normal circumstances, ever had a golf course? Just because you can do it, because you do have the intelligence, you do have the machinery, you do have the economic incentive, et cetera, to do it. And I think this kind of question, fortunately, is becoming more and more obvious because more and more what we see is that this kind of innovation, which allows us to kind of have a fantasy life on the periphery of disaster, is less and less, well, the plausible deniability is less and less plausible, basically, which in some sense is scary, and that's what makes our time critical, and another time it makes it kind of rich with opportunity. Because I think for a lot of people, this is kind of the feeling that you're starting to have, that, you know, capitalism sells itself and presents itself as something which is sexy and attractive, but in the end, when you really get down to the nitty-gritty of it, it's pretty disgusting. So that's the context in which we're talking about innovation in critical times. So then the question is, okay, if that's the problem, then what is innovation? What is innovation if it isn't related to the market? Because the market determines what innovation is. It determines what is valuable, who gets money, who gets celebrated, who's considered a genius and a revolutionary and a 35 under 35 great person, and who isn't. So one really interesting thing that I'd like to show is Stephen Johnson, who's a writer, popular science writer. He wrote a book called Where Good Ideas Come From, and he is basically about innovation. And what he did is that he mapped basically many of the kind of defining innovations that had come in the last 200 years. Actually, he did it over like 500 years, but I'm only showing from 1800 to the present. And he split it up into 4 quadrants. Market individual, so an individual who basically invented something in a market context in order to make money. Market network, so a kind of company or a corporation which made a new innovation in the market context in order to make money, in order to open up a new niche or whatever. And then non-market individual, so an individual who's kind of doing it for themselves as a hobby or within the public sector, within academia, within a charitable organization, social innovation. And then finally, non-market networked. So all of those things, but with group activity. And what he found and what this thing represents is that by far, the most productive, most innovative, most interesting and ultimately beneficial creations are coming from non-market individuals and non-market networks. So this sort of fantasy that the market spurs innovation and that competition and the sort of, you know, evolutionary Darwinian interpretation of how ideas are created and how innovation happens and invention happens is fundamentally wrong. And of course, it's the people who are benefiting from that interpretation who are insisting on it, but it's important for us to know that it's wrong. And Johnson makes a point that I think is really important, this highlighted point. He says, where innovation is concerned, we have deliberately built inefficient markets, environments that protect copyrights and patents and secrets, and 1,000 other barricades that we've erected to keep promising ideas out of the minds of others. So that's the idea. The point is, if you're innovating in critical times, you can't possibly be thinking about the market because the market is designed, and you can't even blame it for it because this is what the market was made to do. It's designed to not share things. So if you're needing ideas that you are based on sharing, are based on mutuality, are based on appropriation, to use an evil word apparently, ideas that basically can be used by the public, by our species. You can't rely on the market because the market is absolutely dead set against that and will be forever. So to conclude, I just want to talk about, that's a kind of preface or whatever prelude to talk about a project that I've done here in Dubai with many others. And it's related to innovation because what we tried to do is provide a kind of physical manifestation, physical case for the prosecution of the argument that I just made, basically, which is that innovation can't be thought about in a market context, and that only thinking about it in a market context means that an incredible amount of intelligence, an incredible amount of sensitivity, value, originality, and ultimately things which could make the world better are being utterly ignored because they don't have market value. They don't have appeal to the people who would fund them and turn them into something. So I'll very quickly run through this. Global Grad Show is an exhibition which is happening next week as part of Dubai Design Week, a little plug there. And basically it's been happening for 5 years now since the first Design Week. And what it is a collection of graduate projects from design and art and technology schools around the world. I think this year, this year it's something like 150 projects from 100 schools in 45 countries and 62 nationalities. So the idea is for it to really be a platform, a kind of neutral territory to see the brightness and thoughtfulness and originality of young people around the world in a non-market context, in a context where they're basically responding to either kind of emotional briefs from their teachers, or things which they've recognized as a problem that they would like to solve within their local context. And I'll just say the way that we describe it is an expo of life-changing inventions from the world's leading design schools. And we use the word inventions intentionally because one of the funny things is that as innovation has increased in popularity and kind of ubiquity, invention has kind of decreased in value. But which doesn't make no sense to me because invention actually is a thing and innovation is a kind of abstraction so of course it does make sense in that sense because everyone can go, I was being really innovative when I accidentally skipped a slide earlier. But I wouldn't say that I invented that because probably other people have done it. So what we try to do in the Global Grad Show is basically focus on the idea behind the work. So rather than showing something in a kind of disciplinary way or in a way which is focused on where it came from, what the school was, what the design discipline is, or anything, what we do is we isolate the idea behind it, the kind of thing that has value regardless of what the physical object is, and present that. So something that, for instance, allows you to open a door without touching it, turn unwanted phones into movie projectors, experience autism, or video sharing for grandparents and grandchildren, crowdsourcing platform for fighting pollution. Anyway, you can all read this. But the point is that what we're trying to do with Global Grad Show is show innovation in its really purest form, which is as new ideas. New ideas that may not have their definitive expression or articulation in the works that you see, but that have immense value as ideas. And so we basically arrange them not according to what they are, but according to what they do. So we have 3 sections: empower, projects that stimulate thought and expand our abilities; connection, projects that encourage exchange and build community; and sustain, projects that make the most of our limited resources. So basically what this allows us to do is group together projects from all over the world, from schools that are radical different sizes, radical different reputations. I have 10 minutes, so now I'm going to accelerate. Actually, no, 10 is fine. And I'll just show a few of the projects, but the point I want to make here is just what we try to do in Global Grad Show, which I think just goes back to my previous point, is try to erase artificial barriers and artificial definitions. So we don't emphasize the schools. Of course, we acknowledge them, but we don't put them in school-specific categories. We don't emphasize geography. What we emphasize is complementary ideas, people who are working in a similar space conceptually, and that hopefully by combining these 2 works next to each other, even though one is from Japan and one is from Chile, you can combine 2 people who could potentially meet each other and come up with a new idea, either together or alone. So for example, I'll just show some projects very, very quickly. A ring that reads for the blind. This is a project which is basically a wearable that allows you to, that reads out for you. You can scan it over text and then it creates an audio expression. A tool for building ethics into artificial intelligence. This is basically something which is designed to test AI and ensure that it has an ethical component to it. A robot farms for worlds without bees. An interesting thing that I've learned making this show, which is of course all made by graduates, so you're talking about people who are young, is that the conversation about climate change is not the kind that old people have, which is, oh no, climate change. It's basically, climate change is happening. How do we respond to it? How do we get in front of it? No one's talking about like stopping climate change. It's basically like that ship has sailed. The people in charge aren't going to do anything about it. It's clear as day. So what do we, as young people who are going to spend the vast majority of everyone on Earth who are going to spend the most time in the future, going to do about it? This is a kind of a beautiful project, which is a kind of water jelly that allows dementia patients who typically don't drink water to be hydrated in a kind of fun way, easy way. A pen that detects cancer. This is another thing to say about the show, which is important, is that some of the things we have are super, super high-tech, kind of groundbreaking projects with a huge amount of investment behind them, a huge amount of peer review, and other ones are just very much simple kind of poetic projects like this. Plant a tree from your home, so it's basically a paper with seeds in it that you can mail somewhere, and if you wanted to plant a tree from your home country or your home city, you could do it in a very simple way. As I said before, can you give me a 1 minute when I need it? As I said before, what's really exciting about Global Grad Show is you can basically see a similar idea being manifest in different places. So this is basically 3 projects which are all about charging your phone, interpreted in different ways. One was a kind of micro wind turbine. One was a sort of solar power thing that you plug onto a windowsill and then you plug into it. And another was a kind of entirely solar powered cell phone. Yeah, these are projects which are about helping differently people of determination, as they say here, which is a phrase I love, blind people or people with one arm to be able to ride a bike or to be able to cut things, an entire kitchen for them. This is a piece of jewelry which treats carpal tunnel syndrome. This is a prosthetic limb for a child that turns a kind of what would be a disability into a kind of superpower. This is a beautiful project that I love. This is basically a kind of kit that turns an IV pole into an imaginary friend for a child who's in hospital and has to spend a lot of time in hospital. Very cheap and easy, but beautiful idea. A kind of case for your cell phone that allows it to be used by a blind person. A kind of system, social networking system that allows people to map a city and determine what the best routes are for people in wheelchairs. This is a kind of, in terms of making the best use of resources, this is a system for what I didn't know, what I learned. One of the millions of things that I've learned making this project is that the container shipping system basically is a one-way system. So you ship something and then you ship it back empty. So basically this proposes that you take all those empty shipping containers and you have a hydroponic farm inside, and that basically you're growing plants and vegetables in what is basically totally wasted space. These are football cleats which are made from recycled bottles. This is a proposal for using abandoned oil tankers and turning those into architectural spaces. This is something which is about transforming Coke bottles into water purification systems. This is a kind of shovel for women in India who collect dung. That's a more sanitary way, simple way. Also, what I like about it, because it's a student project, there's also just weird ones. There's also just weird projects where a kid just was like, yeah, I want to make like a robotic hand that shoots lasers out of it, which I think is also really important and is the beauty of non-market work. It's something which is purely passion-based, and even if it's, purely passion-based. This is an amazing project. This was basically a haptic suit that you wear to experience virtual reality, and I have to say I'm somebody who's spent a fair amount of time in virtual reality, and I find it really, really disappointing. But this was the first time I ever actually thought it was amazing, because you had a physical experience with virtual space, and as you encountered things, you felt it with your body. You weren't just seeing it and kind of going like, oh, that's cool, that's a bit three-dimensional, which is what most VR is like. Anyways, a really beautiful project. Essentially an art project, not like a game. You're not shooting anything or doing anything. You're basically just encountering objects and hearing sounds and then like experiencing them with your body. This is a beautiful project, Autism Empathy Tools. It's designed by a designer who basically wanted to create a set of tools that would allow you to understand what it's like to be autistic, to understand hypersensitivity in your hearing, in your vision, to understand the difficulty of speech. And so one of the things that's really beautiful about Global Grad Show is that we fly in all of the designers and they're there to present their work and to meet each other. And so this is Hyunji, who designed Autism Empathy Tools, and she explained that she basically created the project because her brother is autistic and she had incredible struggle to try to understand what it was like for him. And so she basically used her design practice, her design training, to create a set of tools for people to better understand an experience, which is very, very hard to understand because it's so hard to articulate. And I would say that's really the essence of what Global Grad Show is about. It's the essence of the interpretation of innovation that I would like to encourage and suggest we need desperately in critical times, is one which is much more about deepening the human experience, providing technology and innovation and design, et cetera, to help us better understand each other and get outside of our own experience and understand better in a personal way what's going on for other people, not in a kind of anthropological way, but in a way which is really about you understanding your weakness. It's a wonderful project, especially because it's so popular with children. And ultimately, if we're talking about innovation and we're talking about the future, children are really the only thing we should be talking about. So it's a powerful work in that sense because the designers are so young, it's very easy for them to talk to them and they're not intimidating as professional, famous, rich designers make a habit of being. Okay, so I want to close with this quote from Milton Friedman, who I'm sure all of you are huge fans of. He says, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable." So, you can say with Milton Friedman, if you know who he is, he's a right-wing economist, sort of laissez-faire capitalist. He definitely spoke his truth and lived his truth. He did that. And I think his insight is absolutely right. I think that we are in a moment of critical times, we're in a moment of crisis, and what scares me is the extreme poverty of good ideas that is kind of floating in the conversation, basically. And I think a lot of what we're trying to do with Global Grad Show, and I'm sure what all of you are trying to do, and certainly what this conference is trying to do, is make good ideas and make alternatives for innovation available, so that when it seems like, oh shit, we need to come up with a new plan for generating energy. We've stockpiled a lot of ideas, because ultimately, if we don't do that, it's this kind of zombie approach where you just make a small change to the existing system, you pat yourself on the back, and you pretend like it's going to be all good. And we all know that it won't be all good. So anyway, that's what I would say. In my interpretation, innovation is all those things. And our role, or my role, let's say, as a curator and as somebody as a designer, is to try to spread those ideas as wide as possible and provide a platform for those ideas that's as robust and accessible as possible and as open as possible, so that we can have ideas on hand. Thank you.
Thank you. These were two talks which were on such opposite sides of the spectrum that I now have the privileged job of reconciling the two. And I'm going to do this by hacking it. Not by asking you a question, but perhaps telling two very short stories around innovation from the context that I largely work in, which is in India, and then see if we can come back to a common thread that I'm trying to pull out. So one of my favorite stories about innovation in India has been about how Time magazine discovered a fascinating innovation at the grassroots in 2014. So I hope everybody's had the pleasure of eating Indian food at least once. And if you haven't been to an Indian restaurant, you had a lassi. right? Which is like basically a yogurt smoothie. In the north of India, where there are many, many small lassi makers, getting industrial size lassi makers in a kitchen is like really, really expensive. So what they do is they buy a clothes washing machine and they put yogurt into it. And where you put your detergent, they generally put all the flavorings and the sugar, and then they just churn the yogurt into that, and that makes lassi. They've been doing it for decades. Like I remember in the part of the world where I was growing in, that this was happening when I was like 6, which was a considerable time ago. Time magazine discovered it in 2014 and then kind of made, and this was also the time when India was trying to present itself as, you know, the new innovation capital of the global world and so on. And so it puts these lassi makers on the cover, only to quickly get a lawsuit from the washing machine makers on the lassi makers, saying that you are violating our terms of contract. This machine was not made to make lassi. It was made only to wash clothes. And they, in fact, tried and put an injunction on not using this machine to do anything except for washing clothes, and shut down some of the biggest and the smallest businesses in that part of the world. So I want to kind of hang on to this idea of who decides the parameters of innovation, which I thought was a thread running across both the talks in some ways. And the second story is possibly more sinister, where I don't know how many of you are old enough. I'm guessing you are. Do you remember when the first Mac came out? And do you remember the wonderful ad campaign they had about rip, burn, and mix? Where the promise of a Mac was actually that you will become innovators by ripping, burning, and mixing content, right? You can rip content, mix content, burn it onto a CD, and everybody's going to be their own DJ. So in that year when Apple was kind of aggressively marketing the app as the creative tool for the creative musician and the industry, it was also negotiating with India at the World Trade Organization on India's piracy markets. So India had one of the largest piracy markets between 2005 to 2010. And Apple, along with a lot of other software producers, were basically telling the Indian government that the US had patents to a drug which would cure malaria. So the number one disease that still kills people in India is not HIV/AIDS, it's not cancer, it's not diabetes, it's not TB, it's actually malaria. The US had patents to a drug which they were basically offering to the Indian government, saying that if you do away with the Indian people's capacity to rip, burn, and mix, then we'll give you the rights to reverse engineer malaria in your country, right? So who gets to be an innovator is also kind of something that needs to be brought back into the equation, particularly because while I completely appreciate the idea that we are at a planetary scale, all our differences are merely hair-splitting, there is also a deep power symmetry which kind of allows for the conception of the planetary in some way or the other. But that's just my opening gambit, and I want to kind of bring back the question to both of you, saying not what is innovation, which I understand is largely a pedantic exercise, and it's going to have multiple definitions based on how many different approaches that you have. But I'm just very curious about who do you think is an innovator? Because replacing innovation with invention is not really doing away either with the material asymmetries as well as the political charges of innovation, nor is dissing academia, which I'm quite happy to do, nor is dissing academia and saying step out of the classroom and do something real with the world that you have, going to do away with the legacies of innovation that we have. So I'm now very curious because both of you, for me, seem to be in fact producing a manifesto of who gets to be an innovator and what are the kinds of things that we want to think through. And Clapperton, I'm wondering if you want to begin there. Yeah?
It's not dissing.
I was exaggerating, sorry. No, that's just my dissing. Yeah.
Because you get me in trouble with my friends who say, what the hell are you talking about?
No. It's just me dissing academia and liking it.
Yeah, thanks, Nishant. It's those that can, and there is no point in complaining about things that you see as wrong if you don't act on them. Mm-hmm. It's that hypocrisy that I'm speaking to. If the exercise is to produce knowledge simply because you are curious to learn, I hold no brief against you or for you. But for some of us, it's because we are faced with a continent that's soon going to have the largest youth population in the world. And in an academic culture where once you are educated, that's pretty much it. One person for themselves, God for us all. So, and my interest is to bring back the idea of innovation to a less intimidating place, which doesn't have to be accessed because you know certain kinds of words. You can speak the language. The terrain of innovation hubs in Africa, which defines in this narrow sense what innovation is such that it's urban, it's Steve Jobsy, it's elitist. I'm very worried about that. I am looking for it's why I'm very interested in artists, because they see things, creativity, in a different kind of way. I don't know whether most of our artists are also urban-based, which is perfectly fine if they choose to live so, but my only concern is the rural, which is, it seems like in practice, we are still treating the rural like the colonial governments used to, which is, it's a place of a tradition, being primitive people in the tribes. And that to have made it, you have to come to the city. What defines innovation is very urban, it's robotic. Do we want a robotic move, an urban-centered move in Africa? I'm not very sure. I haven't seen enough to suggest that's a sustainable path. I still need convincing.
Yeah. Thank you. Do you want to respond to that, or just to the question of the notion of the innovator?
I think we should not have a robotic innovation future. For Africa, for anywhere else, frankly, because I think it is too limited of a definition. And your question, who is an innovator? I mean, everybody's an innovator. I just don't. This is kind of what I mean about the ubiquity of the phrase or the word is so annoying, because it's a meaningless word. Because and of course, it's used in a way to justify making a tech hub and going like, well, if you want to innovate, I mean, this is, and so I think that the premise of that should be rejected because one of my favorite things. Well, anyway, just because what innovation is basically a clever solution to a problem. That's what innovation is, and you find that absolutely everywhere. So it's the fact that it's wrapped up in tech or wrapped up in some kind of notion of disruption. All these kind of problematic words is massively, massively limiting to our understanding of what's possible, and also our understanding of who's doing what and what's going on, basically. And I think that's what is frustrating and kind of depressing about the current moment, is how unaware we are of how much, how much kind of really interesting work is going on.
Yeah. Oh, this is really interesting, because both of you are falling back on a theory of creativity now. Let's let go of innovation and just think about clever solutions, which is basically like the age-old idea. All the artists in the room are now happy because that's what we were, right? We're supposed to be creative individuals who look at the world differently, enchant it differently, kind of.
No, but that's kind of what I mean. But that's saying that artists do that is also calm.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I mean. Yeah. It's not like, oh, well, if you're rejecting innovation, then artists are number one.
Yeah.
No. Everybody.
Cool. Yeah, sounds really exciting. And maybe that's also a good space to open up the floor to the questions from the audience.
Can I just say one thing as an addendum? The blame for an academic system that privileges academic activity in class, and the reason why we end up having academic silos or ivory tower is institutional.
Absolutely.
When you go and do these other things on the side, code for doing very creative work outside the academy, they sing about it from the rooftop. but there is no incentive. Sometimes there is even a penalty for doing so.
No, I agree. I mean, I don't want to do a shameless plug, but in my official capacity, I actually represent a community that 3 years ago decided that as an art school in the Netherlands, we need to take a normative and ethical position on what art and design can actually do in the world. So for instance, our new education vision begins by saying art changes, and we have to define what it's going to change, which means that we are no longer training our students, for example, to become artists, performers, designers, musicians, and singers. That's the bare minimum. That's just the tool of the trade. But we are actually defining them by saying that the role of an artist or a designer or an innovator, if you want, is to build resilient futures, equitable societies, and critical diversity. And what happens when we put those parameters upon everything that we do? How do we then evaluate creativity? How do we actually bring around parameters of impact? It's a very turbulent process, and it's a hugely existential one. And I think what you were particularly showing was how deeply existential it becomes in order to kind of return, so to speak, to the home where this cleverness can be applied. So thank you. But can we take some comments or questions or ideas from the audience? There is a hand up here.
Thank you to both. I'll try to make this briefer than last time. Brendan, I really like what you're doing and the way you talked about the grad show, and I think it's wonderful. And for the time you were talking, I really felt the world is a bit better. But then you stopped, and I remembered it's not. So I wonder, and then I thought, you know, it's escapist to a point, and then all of us being here is escapist to a point. But I'm thinking, you know, there's still an institutional pattern happening here. And let's not lie to ourselves, a few of those schools are from the West, but that's beyond the point. Is the grad show, or is anything that is currently happening in that direction, I don't know, reaching out to people who are not institutionalized?
Well, the first thing I'll say, it's not true to say that most of the schools aren't from the West. That's not true. We work very, very hard for that not to be the case, so I have to push back on that. No, the answer is no, there aren't. I mean, within the schools themselves, there's efforts to reach out to people who are not institutionalized. I mean, many, many efforts to have studios that are engaging certain populations and trying to get people to understand or to be involved in the process. So in that sense, yes. But as Global Grad Show, no. But what I would say is, I think that to do something well, you have to know what you're trying to do and not do more than you're trying to do. Because, I'll give you an example. They just had in Dubai, there's a thing called First Global, which is basically a robotics competition for children. And it was absolutely amazing. There was 192 countries represented. Also, there was a team of stateless children. There was, things that you wouldn't expect, countries you wouldn't expect, basically. And it was really beautiful. And it was, for 3 days, it was a little society run by kids who were like 12 and younger, who were just obsessed with robots or whatever. Anyway, and then they did something which I thought was really kind of unfortunate, is that they wrapped the whole thing up in this kind of totally fake response to pollution of the oceans, basically. They said, oh, you're building robots to collect plastic from the ocean. But they weren't doing that. They were building unbelievably simple robots that can pick up a ball and put it in a basket. And that's enough. Because getting 192 different countries together and getting children from all these different walks of life to basically have the same kit of parts and only have their talent and their energy and their commitment distinguish what one is doing from the other, that's beautiful. And that's enough. So then to tack on something that goes, yeah, and by the way, we also care about the environment, to me it's like polluting it. And it does, no pun intended. And it doesn't do anything. So that's all I would say about Global Grad Show. I completely recognize your point, and I think it's a really important one. But for us to take on that responsibility would be, first of all, a nightmare because we're just a little show that exists for 5 days. But number two, it would take away from what we're actually trying to do, which is hard enough as it is. So.
Can I just jump in and say, for the center that we are trying to create there, I want it to be a space where students can go the other way, which is to have a lot more experience in the real world. And the research aspect of this is that they need to understand society top to toe. While they've understood it, growing up within it, with its values, I now want them to see that that's valuable skills that can enable them to then think about the technological, think about whatever robots then get built must at all times be inserted into the kind of realities that they are imagining from.
Yeah.
And I want them to come in and work with people that are in the communities, in local schools, a kind of mixing vessel for great ideas. I have seen this movement into the university and across the universities, such as the one he's talking about. I want to see more. I want these kids to go out in the communities.
And I think, thank you. And I think because in both the responses, there is also a very clear idea that you need to be able to look at a larger ecosystem as opposed to that one instance.
Yeah.
Right? Because there is an obvious pipeline of schools which are feeding into the global grad show. And there is a pedagogic work which has to be done there, whereas this is only a showcase space. At the same time, the fact that you are de-disciplining and deterritorializing the projects allows for a different kind of clustering to happen and orientation to emerge. So I think that's something I definitely take away from the conversation. There's a question over there. Would you please speak in the mic because we're also recording?
Hi, I'm gonna try to formulate something that's a bit complex in my mind. And it's addressed to both or the three of you, whomever wants to take part of it on. Brandon, when you ended, you spoke about perhaps the danger of making certain changes within established systems, or if that's at least what I got. And looking at the title of that's on the screen, when we speak about critical, if we take the moon cycle, new moon, full moon, and then it ends, right? When we're in critical times, we're actually in probably down cycles or cycles that are at the cusp of change from down to up, etc. And the word innovate, of course, has the origin of new, just like the new moon. We don't say the moon is dead and then reborn or born. We just focus on the new. And I think there's a fundamental issue in the way we present even conversations like these under a title like that, when we try to force critical and innovate at the same time and miss out on a word or perhaps a set of words that are an extraction from reflection, quietness, depth, understanding of the nothing, so that emergence, like a bear going into hibernation, etc. And I find it quite troubling at the higher level that it's a very forceful way of understanding certain stages. And I'd love.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one of the problematic aspects of innovation and the culture that is most passionate about advocating for it is its insistence on the present being utterly unlike the past and the future being totally unrecognizable from the past. And of course, that's nonsense, you know? And I think a lot of the anxiety of a word like critical, it comes from that feeling like, we've got to throw out the rule book here. Like, we're in uncharted territory and we have no idea what to do. Yeah. And that's, of course, that's exactly what the people in charge want. Anyways, I completely take that point.
Yeah, it's a marketing gimmick, you would say. For me, the issue is about not just what are we gaining when we acquire something new or make something new, but of the reflection behind the center that we're establishing is what are we destroying? So there is a do no harm in there, but there is also the death of ways of doing things, which are killed by the two things that I've observed to kill knowledge as practiced. One is that when something easy replaces that which is prevailing. A robot can do all the work for you. Why do I need to go to the field? The other one is cheapness. This is very easy to afford. Why should I spend 20, 30 days trying to build something or to do something from here? Those are the things that I think we need to be really aware of in whatever we do about creating things. Because creating is always a question of what you are replacing or destroying. Could it be done any other way? For me, that's the question.
Okay. We're quickly running out of time, so I'm going to take two questions together and then ask for a response from the panel. Nanjala first, and then the gentleman there.
I think she also had a question. Okay. I wanted to invite you both to respond to something, which is the unspoken element of resources and how resources get allocated. A big part of innovation, in my view, is play. And being able to freely play with ideas. You even see it in other species, like how lions learn how to hunt is they learn how to play with each other, with their parents and everything, and they become better at it. And the ability and the freedom and the flexibility to play has become increasingly connected to resources. You have to have money. I was at Stanford last week, and they are doing this thing called a mobile laptop orchestra. And they're basically inventing apps that allow phones and computers to behave like musical instruments for no reason other than it's interesting and it's cool. Yeah. And I remember sitting in that audience thinking, why? Expletive, we haven't even figured out how to provide clean water to more than half of the world's population. The thing in itself is cool, but then to contextualize it in the global conversation about resources and who gets the ability to play and who gets the ability to invent for the sake of invention. So I'd like to invite you both to react. And I know why the young lady was asking about universities concentrated in the global north, because on your map, you didn't have a single design school in Africa. And I think you had like 3 in Asia. And I think that's kind of what she was responding to, because I had the same reaction. I was like, oh, that's sad. To invite this broader conversation of how you see this political economy of resources affecting the ability for people to play, to invent. And I love the way you distinguish between innovation and invention, because to me, invention requires freedom, flexibility, play, and discovery. But we're increasingly living in a world where more than half of the world does not have the luxury of play. And it ties into what Clapperton was saying about, we have a Swahili play that says one of the most impactful things I've ever heard. He says, I'm translating, submarines, everyday submarines, but have you ever built a submarine? And it was a critique to the way in which knowledge is passed on, framed, handed over in developing countries. We have to build for development. We have to build for things. So there's a duality here that I wanted you guys to just respond to, is in your view, where is the reconciliation between the scarcity of resources, the idea of invention with purpose and direction, at the same time with the idea of how we frame innovation and invention necessarily excluding so much of the world in the conversation? It's a long question.
It's a long question. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but because you are both so smart, you have 40 seconds each to respond to that, to solve the question. And then one last question over here, please. It's here. Sorry, I'm just going by the order of hands that came up. Okay, then one last question then and you can forfeit your chance. All right.
We have 40 seconds
40
to answer
seconds.
2 questions.
No,
Yeah.
Nanjala's question first. Okay.
Okay, you want us to answer that right now? Yeah.
Should I ask the question first?
Go. I will say that not all things require big money. And this is an invitation and a plug to those organizations that are interested to work on a very lean budget on how you go about doing that. Some of the things don't need money at all. Like you can put springs back into an entire valley just by building a well. You raise the water table. It does not require money or that much at all. So that's what I would say. And it's usually these simple solutions that can enable people to have, say, and sell, say, spring water if they wanted to sell. But to have access to clean water is enough.
Okay, I'll just say, and I don't mean to keep defending global graduate, but I do have to do it. Like the conclusion that because first of all, there were schools in Africa and global graduate, but the conclusion that it's not being represented, the global South is not being represented, is I take issue with it simply because what you don't know is how unbelievably hard it is to get feedback and to get schools to actually engage the opportunity. And that's part of the global imbalance and part of the fact that big schools have marketing departments. They have departments that you can easily get them and they recognize an opportunity and they take it. I would say in terms of my personal time of trying to build our network, I would say I spend 80% of the time working on African schools, South Asian schools, South American schools, and 10 just like writing emails to European schools or American schools and going like, hey, we got this thing going on, get with it. So, and there's 2 aspects of that related to your notion of play. One is simply the kind of openness to the opportunity and the kind of difficulty of locating the person who will take it seriously within the institution. And the second thing is that the reality is that within those parts of the world, design isn't really even a thing that people aspire to in the schools. It's incredibly hard to find design departments. You find engineering departments and you find architecture departments, but you don't find the kind of departments that we typically drew from. So we did have architecture projects and engineering projects in the show, but a lot of that is because I think what many students told me is that within that, let's say a country like Pakistan, design is considered a kind of frivolous thing. And engineering is a serious thing. Architecture, that's a real thing. Design is still considered a form of play. So that's a problem. That's a macro problem because ultimately it's a self-fulfilling thing where you don't even have that many programs to even approach.
I asked for 10 seconds, right? This is why the question asked earlier about going beyond academia makes sense. Because a lot of design work can be distinguished from art these days. In fact, in the African context, it's certainly true. This is precisely why a lot more people are going outside academia to found institutions. And if you look in institutions, you may not find anything. If you look outside the academy, it's about how long a list you want.
Yeah. Okay. One last question. Can you please keep it short?
Sure.
Okay.
So my question is more broadly about technology and its implications. Brendan, at one point you alluded to this kind of dystopian vision of the future, humans versus machines, and how artificial intelligence and virtual reality are eroding our way of life. Do you think there's a way back to steering ourselves towards a course where we reap the benefits of this technology while minimizing the damage, or are we kind of too far gone at this point?
No, we're absolutely not too far gone. And that's kind of what I was trying to say is we're very much at the precipice of it. So we're not too far gone. The problem is that the counter-argument from the system that's going to deliver us a kind of more intense version of what we already have, which is basically data capitalism. All of your interactions within a virtual space are basically just surveillance that can be then monetized and sold. That, which is what the reality of using a social network is, that kind of being built out into something which is then also involving your genome, your kind of 24-hour behavior, all of your relationships, etc. that's where it seems to be going. And if we allow the default settings to continue, that is where it will go, because that's what the infrastructure that has built it up, those are the assumptions that they've decided matter. And then all I'm saying is that I think that as consumers, if that's what we want to define ourselves, or as people or whatever, it is essential to demand another interpretation of it, because it wasn't always like that. Like, it's important for people to know that the internet and the computer were developed in a totally non-commercial environment, and they had no commercial. It was a tool, basically a neutral tool. And in a lot of the kind of most interesting, most humanistic applications of the computer came from that period. And then it got plugged into a system which is just about how do you figure out how to make the most money from advertisers possible. And now we have what we have. But I don't think it's too late. What I would say is just, it's really important for us to understand what the assumptions are behind it, what it wants out of you, what it assumes a social relationship to be like, or what it assumes you and your life and your complexity as a person to be. And I think a natural response would be to be offended by what their assumptions are and push back against them. Because otherwise it is kind of scary, only because there's several technologies which we don't even really deal with yet that are very much coming. And if they develop in the same way that the internet has developed, I think it's not great.
Yeah, okay. Clapperton, last words, and then we can wrap up.
I am an African. We have never had any technology in the past that we have never failed to tame. I think it's important to really think seriously about human intelligence as a solution to this automation apocalypse. I think I live in hope.
Okay. I think hope is a wonderful way to end the panel. I want to thank both of you for kind of just thinking through not what the work is in doing innovation, but what is the work of innovation in the critical times. Maybe that's how we need to frame it. I apologize that we are late, but I grew up in India. We think of time as a suggestion, not as a guideline. And on that note, thank you, both of you. And please join me in thanking them and applauding the wonderful audience and the engaged questions. Thank you.
Is this?
We're going to share very quickly with you the Digital Earth project, because we are all here at the Digital Earth Talks. So we thought it would be nice to at least say something about the project, where it came from, and also where it's heading towards. So we will be giving a kind of light talk on this, not theoretical, and no ponderings on technology, but just the project itself. So my name is Arthur Steiner. Next to me, Leonardo Della Noce, and together with René Raukens, who's sitting here in the front, we are the Digital Earth team. Why this project and what's going to happen? So Digital Earth started about a year ago, I think, yeah. And it's actually a kind of global research network of artists and scholars that investigate, map, and try to understand how 21st century geopolitics, how 21st century technology shapes geopolitics and our understanding of the world. You could see actually Digital Earth as a kind of global think tank, or maybe better, a global do tank, or we have always also called it an imagination tank, because it's beyond just thinking, that looks into how different parts of the world are changing because of these planetary scale technological developments. So geopolitics are rapidly changing because of these global technological developments. Think about, for example, the Chinese owned computer villages in West Africa, to tech companies like Google taking the role of states, for example, through Google ID, or even states that are morphing into. I think. Is it working? Yeah, or like this sounds better. Or like nation states that are morphing into tech companies like Estonia, for example, with their e-residency and their digital form of governance. So you see all these kind of developments that are shaping our current world. Also, for instance, the current battle between Trump and Huawei that is carving up the tech world along national boundaries. And I think the Financial Times, I think, has called this the balkanization of technology. The Economist, yeah. The kind of balkanization of technology. So how tech companies are creating geolocked services across different markets. So how to make sense of this multiplicity in technology around the world. And how can we map out, picture, and grasp how these rapid global technological developments shape geopolitics in different parts of the planet? And how does this work out in different parts of the world? So I think these were the starting points and the starting questions why we set up the Digital Earth Fellowship. Together and exchange global knowledge on this and bringing together researchers, artists, and designers from different geographic regions through this fellowship. So this year we did the fellowship with 20 artists that you will see here on the background and that are also here in the audience actually. That did a specific project, a specific research project on a specific location. So some of the fellows, they went to China, to Shenzhen, to study like the relation between these tech markets in Western Africa. Others looked into the mines in Congo. Others looked into the technological traditions in Uganda. And others looked into large infrastructural projects like the Digital Belt and the Road Project. So very diverse practices across the world. And it's coming to an end this year. But we have been working with these fellows over last year, providing them with the stipends. So we provided the monthly research stipends to conduct this research and produce an actual work. And we also provided like a kind of infrastructure of like courses, mentoring by artists and by researchers and scholars. And the outcomes are now being finalized in the forms of artworks, documentaries, research papers, and some of them are currently also being exhibited in the Centre Pompidou in Paris. So we're very proud. Okay. You're going to stand there. Okay. Yeah, so we are really proud of that some of the research outcomes of the Digital Earth were presented in the Centre Pompidou. And also the coming months, more of the outcomes will be presented in other art spaces around the world. Yeah, these are events and gatherings. So prior to this event here in Dubai, we also organized other gatherings and events to exchange knowledge between people that are looking into these technological developments and how they play out with geopolitics. We organized these events in Moscow, in Senegal, in India, and in Beirut. And I think one of the two main themes that came out of these events and out of the fellowships are cartographies and cosmologies. And these are also the two themes that we chose here in Dubai as the running themes throughout this conference. So when we talk about cartographies, we talk about how we can map these technological developments in different geographical zones through these data centers, mineral mines, fiber cables, etc. And when we talk about cosmologies, we talk about like the different ways how technology shapes our understanding of the world, and also this idea that technology is not this universal standard, but actually that there are different ways and different understandings of technology in different regions. So we base that also on the work of Yu Kui, Chinese philosopher, and his concept of cosmotechnics. So what are the next steps? Leonardo will say something about that with regards to the publication. Also, we will announce a new fellowship round next year, so we're really excited about that. It will start in August, so we'll again support for a period of 6 months a cohort of artists to look into these questions. And the second thing is that we are very interested to work more on this educational parts of the program, also based on the Knowledge Studio organized by Nishant Shah. So we're very interested in looking into that as well. But the most tangible follow-up of Digital Earth will be actually the publication. And Leo, you will say something about this, this publication.
Yes, I hope the pointer will be kinder to us than it has been so far. Yes, great. Okay, so Arthur kind of gave an overview of what has been done, kind of news that we're going to continue then next year. But next year we are also going to publish, hopefully, around December, this publication titled The Vertical Atlas. There are also some people in the room that participated in research labs we organized in the Netherlands around this topic. So this is a beautiful cover by Kevin Bray, who is a French artist, was tasked to make sense of the title and give a perception to the public of the events. So in this new atlas we are aiming to create, we envision to show the research by the people of the Digital Earth program, but also a wider group of artists, architects, and researchers from different disciplines and from different geographic contexts. So this atlas will include actually maps. So it is going to be an atlas, but not only in the traditional form of cartographical work as we know it, or diagrammatic representation, complex data visualization, but rather we envision these maps to be made by artists and designers in collaboration with technologists and researchers. So there are going to be artworks. So art is going to be the method through which to create these maps. And these maps will be coupled with text by experts of the field. So they're going to kind of speak to each other, although it's going to be mostly visual, really an atlas of the reality of the world today. And we are probably going to also augment it digitally. This is to be seen. So why we've chosen the format of an atlas in 2019 at all, or to publish a book instead of make this knowledge available online. So we chose the format of the atlas because an atlas can provide a navigational tool for humans to navigate through the complexity of this reality, this kind of ungraspable planetary scale computation, if you're familiar with the term, or many of the realities that was also spoken of today. However, we also think that a new atlas is needed. So Vertical Atlas will be an atlas to help people to navigate these complex technogeographies, but this time not horizontally, but vertically. What does that mean? We're going to get to that very soon. So the final aim is to make sense of this abstract technological development worldwide. So what are the characteristics of this atlas to be? The first one is that it's going to be multiple focuses. So because planetary scale, technological developments play out differently at different geographic zones, this atlas will have multiple focuses and perspectives from different geographic zones that are investigated. So an important first point, of course, to address is that the standardizing gaze of modern, and I would add also European cartography, is not the point of view from which this atlas will be ultimately made. The abstraction of the Mercator projection, and we are all familiar with, we all went to school and saw these maps. So these modern maps account for very little of the new realities we are confronted with, and historically also led to this kind of smoothing, this smooth representation of the world that actually hid extreme violence on the ground. So cartography, as we know, has for centuries been a project in service of the existing power structures. So maps depict territories from the perspective of the commissioner. And modern European cartography, we're all aware, largely helped organize the colonial project on the by the Western powers, and in turn reflected and codified its effects. Currently, we see a similar developments with corporate run map like Google Maps and else. So this new type of cartography is made in service of needs of the global and local market powers, and as such, again, reflect a universal and implicitly normalizing perspective all over the world. So in a way, it's a different flavor of the same. Vertical and horizontal. And here a shout out to Vladan Joller, who is sitting here, and tomorrow we'll dive in this beautiful work. We took him as an example, and he's also part of the project. So representing the world as a horizontal plane of nation states and lands, does not do justice to both the complexity of the technological realities we live in, but also to the human realities on the ground. So if neither states or lands are the unit through which we map this reality, what is this unit? So tentatively, in the vertical atlas, we argue that the friction between different sovereignties, between tech giants and states, but also between users, humans or otherwise, and these systems are what we want to focus on. So I can make you a couple of examples of these before mentioning this great work. The European Union, you probably heard, has been implementing this infamous GDPR law, which is an attempt to create a sovereign border in cyberspace. So it's directly to reassert basically political power in the face of the big five, Silicon Valley, and so on. So this is a first attempt, and it's a legal first around the world. And although it's, there are many holes in this legislation, and many experts are not very much convinced by it. It is going to be the standard, probably, because it's the first one in the world to do this attempt. At the same time, the European Union is datafying the refugees coming through the Mediterranean Sea, through satellites and otherwise. So the question that lies at the core is like, what is European data, for instance, and who has a right over that, and what is the sovereignty over that? A similar but different example is the one of the Russian government trying to tie again all these tech giants to the Russian land. So saying to LinkedIn, you have to sign up your data servers to be in Russia, so we can keep control of you through gateways, etc. So we are reasserting this horizontal logic on something that is actually vertical and escapes the logic of the state as such. So a great example that I'm not going to spoil too much because Vladan will speak in depth about it tomorrow, so all come back to hear what he has to say, is the anatomy of AI, in which Kate Crawford and Vladan Yoler went into this great vertical mapping, trying to see the connection and disconnection that make possible Amazon Echo and the computation of Amazon AI and so forth. So from like extractions to the work ethics of the platform and so forth. It's a very complex map. I'm sure we're going to hear more about it tomorrow. So this is one of the examples of what we are aiming at, what kind of mappings by artists like Vladan, etc. we will see in this book. So these new vertical maps are needed to make sense of these connections and disconnections in digital geopolitics today. So the map will be created by artists and designers rather than only cartographers to give tangibility to the phenomena at hand. So we aim, again, to reiterate the point, to form, to kind of like visualize the abstract technological developments and picture these developments from the earth layer with the mines, fiber optic cables of the cloud layer to all the way to the interface and so forth. This way, we hope that this project will provide like a tool for human agency and action within the technological realities we live in.